all the reasons why they had left, all the things that were broken, now being brought back. So they're reinstating festivals. They're fasting. They're wearing sackcloth. They're confessing sins. They're worshiping. They're recalling their story. That was part of this too, right? There's this whole section that remember where we come from, remember our own narrative. We also recall our mistakes. We know we've made mistakes along the way. We're recommitting ourselves to this covenant of walking in God's law. And there's three kind of key things that are important to bring out in their commitment that come to play at the end of the story.
Reaching from way down here. From way down here.
Welcome to Thread, a podcast designed to explore God's story and lead you into a full life in Christ.
Thank you for joining us in this conversation, co-hosted by myself, Hannah Desouza, and Dr. David Pocta. Hello everyone and welcome back to Thread. We are in episode 46 and it's our last episode of this series, God's People Returned. Dave's celebrating over there. I am a bit congested, so I should say apologies for sounding, blocked, because I am.
Well, what a way to come in for a landing. I mean, it's not just the last episode of this series, it's the last episode of the Old Testament.
Yeah, exactly. So lots to cover. We're excited to jump in. And we had a great conversation last week with Melanie Singh where we talked about Esther. And today, this is the last part, as Dave said, of the Protestant Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible. And the plan is for Thread, we've said this before, to be done in 3 seasons. So our first season was Yahweh and the people, which we're finishing. And then the second is Jesus and the people, which will be exciting. And then we have the Spirit and the people as this is 3rd season. So Yahweh and the people, as we said, cover the entire Old Testament story. Season 2 will cover the Gospels, and then season 3 will cover the rest of the New Testament.
That's right. And we do have 2 key kind of episodes to wrap up this season 1 that will bridge the Old Testament to the New Testament. So by the time we're done today, the Jews will be back in Judea, and the year will be around 430 BC.
Amen.
And of course, Jesus isn't born for quite a while. So
right.
These 2 episodes that we're calling the intertestamental period or God's people waited are really important. And not many people know about this era, but we do recognize that when you step into the pages of the Gospels, some things have changed. So that 400 years, there's definitely things that happen that are helpful to understand, both with now the Roman government and where did the Pharisees and Sadducees come from, and why Aramaic and Greek, and there's so many fun things to know. So we will wrap up season 1 with a total of 48 episodes. I can't believe we recorded almost 4. This is 46.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being on the journey.
That's exactly right. Now we have another fun treat for those of you that use the app. We created an exile timeline that we're going to be using today. This is one of the things that I really love about what we're doing is just creating these kind of resources for people. So this exile timeline we're going to look at not only starts with the period as we talked at Jerusalem fall in 586 and goes all the way through to 430, but it highlights the big biblical events and it overlays the importance of the Persian kings that are key in the story. And so when we read Ezra and Nehemiah, we see these important figures like Cyrus and Darius and Artaxerxes. So we can see where those are in the story. So check out the app, go download the slides. So now we've covered a lot of ground. This is 156 years in this era. We've been in exile. The prophets we've talked about during this time were called the exilic prophets. In our last episode, not the last one, 2 ago, we talked about the rebuilding of the temple. Then we talked about that amazing story of Esther with Melanie, as you noted. And now we're going to look at 2 kind of other components, the rebuilding of the community and the kind of the restoration of Torah and the rebuilding of the wall. But as we conclude this kind of meta-narrative of Israel in this period, there's some important things to consider. One is, I just wanted to point out the location in the Bible of Ezra and Nehemiah. It's kind of confusing when those of us who think chronologically, we go, well, wait a minute. If this is the end of the story, why is Nehemiah like not even halfway through the Old Testament? And so when we open our Protestant Bibles, we see Malachi as the last book of the Old Testament because he was the last prophet and contemporary of Nehemiah. But as far as historical events are concerned, Nehemiah actually records the last ones.
So why is this important then? I also recall reading that Ezra and Nehemiah was originally one book. So why also was it separated, would you say?
You're exactly right. It's important because it tells us the final story and where the people kind of left before this period of silence. But as you address, this one book is also important. So in the Tanakh is the name of the Jewish Bible or the Hebrew Bible. And it only has 24 books where our Old Testament has 39 books. Now, that's not because we have more stuff. It's actually the same content. It's just ordered differently and it's grouped differently. So, for example, in our Bible, we have 1st and 2nd Samuel, where they just have Samuel in the Tanakh. Or we have 1st and 2nd Kings. They just have Kings. Same with Chronicles. The minor prophets were one. They were just called the 12 or the minor prophets. And Ezra and Nehemiah were actually one. And it matters because when we look at them from a literary whole, we see a pattern at play that becomes evident when you do look at them together. And so I know we drew our listeners to some things in Ezra that we're going to actually see the pattern repeat. And this is the pattern. And we're going to, again, put a slide up about this so people can see this. But this pattern across Ezra and Nehemiah happens 3 times. 3 times we have a Persian king who empowers a Jewish leader to return and rebuild in Jerusalem. In each of those 3 times, the Jewish leader starts off with great determination and enthusiasm, but then they encounter opposition and they find a way through it. And then in each of these cases, the results are kind of anticlimactic, right? It's not what we'd expect. So we talked about that last episode with Zerubbabel in the temple. And if you remember, I mean, here's this great dedication of the temple, and we have in the background of the history, the tabernacle, when it gets built, we see the Shekinah glory fills. And then when the temple was first built and the priests dedicated, we see the Shekinah glory fill the temple. They couldn't even go in and see it. And then this time when we rebuild the temple, no Shekinah glory, right? Very anticlimactic. So we're going to look at these other 2 movements with now Ezra following the same pattern and then Nehemiah following the same pattern. And we will look at how this kind of same thing doesn't happen. This is the next 2 movements. So let's talk first about rebuilding community. This is Ezra now, and we're in Ezra chapter 7, and Ezra gets empowered by this Persian king, Artaxerxes. And Hannah, would you like to read Ezra 7? And I've just kind of picked a few verses. So verse 1, 6, and 7, and verse 10. And again, we'll put this up on the screen.
After this, in the reign of King Artaxerxes of Persia, Ezra went up from Babylonia. He was a scribe skilled in the law of Moses that Yahweh, the God of Israel, had given. And the king granted him all that he asked, for the hand of Yahweh his God was upon him. Some of the people of Israel and some of the priests and Levites, the singers and gatekeepers, and the temple servants also went up to Jerusalem in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes. For Ezra had set his heart to study the law of Yahweh, and to do it and to teach the statutes and ordinances in Israel.
Right. So this is around 458 BC. Ezra is a scholar. He's a legal expert, and he's a spiritual leader among the Jewish people. So he's this devoted student, and he's a teacher of Yahweh's word. And I think that's also really kind of important to realize the role that scholars and teachers play in helping to restore things. So that's kind of a cool little side point. But what's absolutely remarkable is the letter that King Artaxerxes gives in Ezra 7 to accompany. So remember, we talked about these Persian leaders. They actually empowered the Jewish leaders to return with great kind of enthusiasm. behind it. And so basically what this letter says is any people or priests that want to go with Ezra can go. The king, his counselors, and the people of Babylonia were to freely give gold and silver to this project.
Wow. That's nice.
Yeah. Ezra was to take this gold and silver to buy offerings for the worship, and then he was able to spend the rest of the money as he saw fit. The king also commanded that the treasurers fulfill Ezra's request diligently and that they were exempted from any taxes for those that were to work on the temple.
Also nice.
Also very nice. So Ezra is empowered to appoint judges and magistrates to enforce the law, and he was able to actually penalize those that disobeyed. And so he's given not only money and this decree to go, but he's given the power and the authority to actually restructure the community when he gets back to Judah. So he sets off with great determination, and we see in Ezra 7:27, Hannah, if you don't mind.
Blessed be Yahweh, the God of our ancestors, who put such a thing as this into the heart of the king to glorify the house of Yahweh in Jerusalem, and who extended to me steadfast love before the king and his counselors, and before all the king's mighty officers. I took courage, for the hand of Yahweh my God was upon me, and I gathered leaders from Israel to go up with me. So this is all sounding great, but I know things go off course. So where do things go wrong?
They do. Yeah, they get some opposition here. So the officials inform Ezra that the Israelites, including the priests and Levites, had intermarried with surrounding nations. So this leads to this mixing of the holy seed with the foreign people. So we see this really interesting interlude here. Ezra's really distressed. He tears his garments and he's there in shock. And then during the evening sacrifice, he prays to God and he confesses the guilt of his people. He acknowledges the consequences of their actions and the captivity and disgrace and how all that's come together. He laments the pollution of the land, the danger of further disobedience because of intermarriage. He pleads for God's justice and mercy. And after this kind of prayer and response, one of the officials comes to Ezra and he says, look, I think you need to send away all the foreign women and their children. In other words, he's basically saying, Ezra, tell them all to get divorced and send their families away.
That's
so
intense.
Ezra does this, right? Now, I think it's important to note that this was not God's direction. This was one of his officials' direction. We don't read about any prayer. We don't read about any intercession from Yahweh. But Ezra makes this proclamation for all these exiles to come to Jerusalem within 3 days. And if they aren't compliant, then they would forfeit their property and they would be excluded from the community. So, I mean, he's hardcore. Yeah. So on this day, not only do all these people kind of gather trembling because of this command, come or lose your property, but it's raining, right? And so here he is confronting the people about their transgressions, it's pouring down rain, and they say, look, can you just have some representatives examine our cases for, where we're at? And so that's what they do. They gather some different representatives and they make a list of all the people and basically say you need to divorce and send your families away. And what we read is in chapter 10, we read about those that did this.
Right. Yeah, we don't often see weather mentioned in the Bible. So it kind of adds to the atmosphere, I think, of this day. And I was kind of taken aback to see that long list of names in chapter 10 of all those that intermarried. The Bible is naming names. No one is safe.
It's true.
But I think also this is a very radical act of Ezra. And for me, I think, again, reading this narrative, I couldn't help but think how devastating, really, this would have been for the women being sent away, families being broken up. So what are we to make of this kind of radical act?
Well, so in and of itself, it's kind of hard to make sense of it. And I think that's where the meta-narrative gets really important here. So yeah, many families are sent away. Although what we realize is that this is not necessarily an exhaustive list. There's a bigger story unfolding, and we're going to see it play out here as we go on. So this story, as I said earlier, takes place around 458. And we see, and the reason that matters is we also know that there was a contemporary prophet at this time, Malachi. And when you read the prophet Malachi, especially in chapter 2, verses 13 to 16, in conjunction with this act that Ezra enacts, you kind of see, okay, here's a tension here. And I think it'd be good for us to read it. Hannah, can you read Malachi? What is Malachi saying at the same time around that this is happening?
And this you do as well. You cover Yahweh's altar with tears, with weeping and groaning, because he no longer regards the offspring or accepts it with favor at your hand. You ask, why does he not? Because Yahweh was a witness between you and the wife of your youth, to whom you have been faithless. Though she is your companion and your wife by covenant, did God not make them one flesh with spirit in it? And what does the one desire? Godly offspring. So look to yourselves and do not let anyone be faithless to the wife of his youth. For I hate divorce, says Yahweh, the God of Israel, and covering one's garment with violence, says Yahweh of hosts. So take heed to yourselves and do not be faithless. Wow.
Right? I mean, talk about a contrast. So, here Yahweh says, I hate divorce. And he also says that violence is not the solution. And we're going to see violence, not just, you could argue that Ezra's response is a little violent, but you're going to certainly see violence with Nehemiah here in just a little bit. So what do we see happening here? We see this spiritual leader, Ezra, who's very, intent on reinstilling, rebuilding, restoring. And that instinct is fantastic. Sometimes the way we behave around that isn't always as spiritual leaders, but we'll see that unpack here a little bit. So this next piece we now move to is rebuilding the wall. So this is kind of the third movement. So we looked at rebuilding the temple with Zerubbabel. We looked now at kind of rebuilding the community or restoring the Torah with Ezra. And now we're going to move about 14 years later to the story of rebuilding the wall.
So we're moving now to the book of Nehemiah, which is a first-person report by Nehemiah. So that's interesting. He's telling this story. And we're told in chapter 1 of Nehemiah that he is cupbearer to King Artaxerxes. And I have a nerdy fact. I talked about the Cyrus cylinder in the British Museum.
You did.
Also in the British Museum is this silver bowl or wine cup that belonged to King Artaxerxes. From 464 BC. It's got this beautiful lotus design in it in silver and an inscription of Artaxerxes around the rim. But Nehemiah might have drunk from that bowl. Who knows?
Maybe Nehemiah's fingerprint is on it.
It could be his DNA. So check it out if you're in London. So he's cupbearer to the king. He's got this influential position. And it's while he's in this role that he becomes aware of how desperate the situation has become in Jerusalem from his brother Hanani. Maybe you can read this part here, Dave, in verse 3 to 4.
Sure. They replied, the remnant there in the province who escaped captivity are in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. When I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, fasting and praying before the God of heaven.
And we'll see that prayer is really a hallmark of Nehemiah. And I think it's why he's used in many leadership lessons. You'll see him featured, but it's a consistent response of his to kind of obstacles, and we'll see that in the narrative. But in that opening prayer too, you'll see a lot of references to the Torah. He's very saturated in scripture. But he also can't hide his emotions at this news. And showing emotion like this was not proper in the king's presence. And we remember that from the book of Esther, where Mordecai, when he's in sackcloth, he's not even allowed to enter the king's gate. So Artaxerxes demands to know the reason for this depression. And I think Nehemiah is scared. He's been discovered, and he responds in chapter 2, verse 3 by saying, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad? When the city, the place of my ancestors' graves, lies waste and its gates have been destroyed by fire." So he's honest about his sadness. And amazingly, Artaxerxes is receptive. He asks Nehemiah what his request is. And then he goes on to allow him to return to Judah to rebuild it. And in fact, even Nehemiah says it pleased the king to send me. So again, we see this amazing favor of God through these foreign kings. And Nehemiah is kind of emboldened by the king's response. He requests to be provided with letters for the governors that he'll encounter, asking for safe passage, and a letter to the keeper of the king's forest, which is just a cool job, I think. And he asks for timber to make beams for the gate, and the king grants this too, and he even sends officers of the army and cavalry to accompany Nehemiah for protection. So we see Nehemiah credit God with this favor. He says, the king granted me what I asked, for the gracious hand of my God was upon me, in chapter 2, verse 8. So then we see Nehemiah sets off with real determination. But again, they encounter opposition, and we'll see this come up again. So sadly, not everyone is thrilled about this restoration mission. And we can see here in chapter 2, verse 10. Can you read this part, Dave? These names?
Sure. Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 10. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard this, it displeased them greatly that someone had come to seek the welfare of the Israelites.
Yeah. They go on to mock and ridicule Nehemiah for this effort. But the building goes ahead in spite of this. And in chapter 3, it's interesting to read all the different types of people that rally together to rebuild the wall. We see listed priests, Levites, goldsmiths, even perfumers are mentioned. My brother works in perfume, so he's mentioned in scripture. Perfume is important.
Okay.
Whole families, including daughters, it says. So these aren't professional builders, but everyone plays their part here. But again, we see opposition continues, and you can read here in 4 verse 7.
But when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the repairing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward and that the gaps were beginning to be closed, they were very angry.
Yeah. And again, we see the response of Nehemiah is to pray in response to this opposition. And he reassures the Jews that God is on their side in spite of the opposition. And we see the builders work with swords strapped to their sides just in case, in shifts. So in addition, though, to external opposition, there's even this period of internal opposition with some of the wealthier Jews oppressing those that are poorer, and with heavy debts and things. And Nehemiah rebukes the nobles and officials for this. So it's cool that he doesn't just tell the poorer people to get on with the building, but he actually takes notice of this injustice that's taking place and rights that within the people. So finally, the wall is completed in chapter 6. Thank goodness. And then in chapter 7, we see Nehemiah find the book of genealogy. So this is something that also comes up in Ezra 2. So it contains the names of all the exiles who were the first to come back to Israel after having put down roots in Babylon for 70 years. Now, it's easy to rush through lists of names like this. I know I can do that. But this list is significant in that it represents all the families who are willing to leave the security of the life that they had built in Babylon and exchange it for an uncertain future, really, in a desolate Jerusalem. So these people really were pioneers. And according to some commentators, only about 2% of the Jews who were carried into exile come back, which is kind of amazing.
Right. Like, that's interesting to think about that. Because you always kind of picture that all the Jews go back.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, 2% return. That's a very, very small number.
Yeah. I have a friend right now in my class who's from Venezuela, and he's coming to church with me right now. But he had to leave for political reasons when he was 18, and he's in exile from his home in a way. But these verses mean something different to him, that sense of longing for a home and longing to return. But it's mixed feelings too, because you're returning to an uncertainty. Like, can I go back? Should I go back, or should I keep building a life outside? So we do see a real faith of the people that choose to come back. I'm sure there was joy, but there's also a lot of uncertainty. Now, in chapter 8, Ezra the priest summons the people into the square, and here we get to see him read the book of the law to them. And it says in verse 3 that he read it from early morning until midday in the presence of the men and the women and those who could understand, and the ears of all the people were attentive to the book of the law. So this was about 6 hours of reading. And the people stood as he read, which shows a real respect for the word. And we see this response of collective worship. They're bowing with their faces to the ground. They're weeping. We see a place for both grieving and rejoicing here because they have this time of mourning, but then also there's this celebration too. The Feast of Booths is celebrated. So we see this real revival come from the reading of God's word. Then in chapter 9, we see collective confession of sin, and they recall God's faithfulness to them, and they make a renewed commitment to their covenant with him. And we see Nehemiah and the priests sign this in writing. They put their seal on this.
This is kind of a significant time to pause here and recognize all that you just shared. So what we've just witnessed is this pretty full, thorough explanation of restoration. All the reasons why they had left, all the things that were broken, now being brought back. So they're reinstating festivals. They're fasting. They're wearing sackcloth. They're confessing sins. They're worshiping. They're recalling their story. That was part of this too, right? There's this whole section that remember where we come from. Remember our own narrative. We also recall our mistakes. We know we've made mistakes along the way. We're recommitting ourselves to this covenant of walking in God's law. And there's three kind of key things that are important to bring out in their commitment that come to play at the end of the story. They make a commitment not to intermarry. They make a commitment not to trade or work on the Sabbath. And they make a commitment to financially support the temple. This all looks great. And it seems to culminate in every possible grand way. And so it says at the end of all of this in Nehemiah chapter 12, verse 43, they offered great sacrifices that day and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy, and the women and children also rejoiced. The joy of Jerusalem was heard far away.
Now, this would be a great place for the book to end, but it doesn't end here.
Yes, the results are anticlimactic. And in Nehemiah 13, we start seeing this really important and interesting tension and problem. And chapter 13, I mean, if you look at chapter 13 by itself, it's like, this is a strange chapter. But again, it has to be really thought through in this kind of meta-narrative, not just of Ezra and Nehemiah, but the whole meta-narrative of the Old Testament and the things we know that are still to come. And so what we see is this Nehemiah, this man Nehemiah, who is deeply committed to righteousness and purity, and he's indignant and he's emotional when things don't go the right way. But in every way that the Jews had just committed to be faithful, we're going to start seeing them fall short.
Right. Yeah. And do you know how much time has passed between, I guess, this completion of the wall, this rededication of their commitment, and now this falling short? Because I know Nehemiah returns to King Artaxerxes, and then he comes back again to Jerusalem. So some time has passed in between.
Yeah, you're right. It has. It's only been about 12 years. But here we now step back in 12 years. And let's go back through those commitments, right? They were committed to the temple, the Sabbath, the intermarriage issue. Let's just revisit those in chapter 13 and see what happens. So let's talk about the temple first. The priest, Eliashib, I think's his name, Eliashib, cleared a room in the temple that was supposed to hold the offerings for the temple and gives it to his relative, Tobiah. Now, do you remember who Tobiah was in the story?
So he was the Ammonite who opposed Nehemiah, right? The building of the wall.
Exactly. So now the guy who was opposing Nehemiah gets a room in the temple because of his relative, the priest, and they cleared out the room for the offerings. I mean, wow. Okay, so in Nehemiah 13:8, Nehemiah says, "And I was very angry, and I threw all the household furniture of Tobiah out of the room." So we start seeing, I mean, we've known Nehemiah to be emotional, but now we start seeing him angry and acting on his anger. He's literally throwing furniture out of the temple. The Jews, of course, were also, not of course, but the Jews were also not tithing as they had committed. And so Nehemiah appoints treasurers. And in this little section of chapter 13, it concludes with Nehemiah praying. And this is going to be the conclusion of every one of these three issues. This one, you want to read his prayer here in Nehemiah 13:14?
Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for his service.
So we're going to start seeing Nehemiah praying, remember me, God, and look at what I'm doing on your behalf, right? Okay, then we get to the Sabbath issue. So now Nehemiah finds people working on the Sabbath. They're selling goods inside the walls. Then he shuts the doors of the city. He pushes the merchants out and they stay by the gate. He's like, they don't even leave. So Nehemiah 13:21, Hannah.
I warned them and said to them, why do you spend the night in front of the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you. That's so funny. From that time on, they did not come on the Sabbath.
Yeah, I mean, what's the threat here? If you don't leave, I'm going to beat you up, right? So,
wow, this is God's
again,
leader.
Yeah, we see Nehemiah's anger, we see his threats, and then again, he turns around and prays. 13:22.
Remember this also in my favor, O my God, and spare me according to the greatness of your steadfast love.
Yeah, remember this also in my favor, in my behavior in my favor. Okay, then we get to the intermarriage piece, and this one just goes off the rails. So Nehemiah finds some Jews married to foreign women. We already addressed this back with Ezra. His response, chapter 13:25.
And I contended with them and cursed them and beat some of the men and pulled out their hair. And I made them take an oath in the name of God. What? That is intense.
Yeah. I mean, so he starts fighting with them. He starts cursing them. And he starts beating them and pulling out their hair. Okay. He's got a little unhinged. So the final, and this is right after this, the final verse of the book of Nehemiah, which is the final verse in the chronology of the Old Testament. Hannah, what does it say?
Thus I cleansed them from everything foreign, and I established the duties of the priests and Levites, each in his work, and I provided for the wood offering at appointed times and for the first fruits. Remember me, O my God, for good.
Yeah, same thing at the end. So he prays that God will remember him in a positive way. Look, and this is a challenging thing that I see spiritual leaders wrestle with all the time. They have high expectations. They're trying to uphold God's law. How that gets handled, it's very tempting to want to lay hands on people, to curse at people, to pull out their hair. I mean, we certainly understand that instinct. But it's important here to back up just for a minute, because a lot's happened recently. And these prophets that we saw, these exilic prophets, shared some really important vision during this period of time that we need to revisit as we kind of land this in this Old Testament narrative. So we are basically left in the Nehemiah story with spiritual leaders that are aspiring to a vision that the spirituality of the people just can't live up to. And a little bit before this, Zechariah had this vision 70 years earlier. And one of the interesting things that he talks about is a city without walls. And then Nehemiah comes and builds walls. So this is, again, one of those tensions. Can you read that one for us, Hannah? Zechariah 2:4-5.
Jerusalem shall be inhabited like unwalled villages because of the multitude of people and animals in it. For I will be a wall of fire all around it, says Yahweh, and I will be the glory within it.
So one of the things that we know in this vision of restoration, and we've picked this up before, restoration isn't full restoration. It's an already but not yet paradigm. We are coming to see God working and we're rebuilding the temple, but the vision of the temple's bigger. We've come to rebuild walls, but God's actually envisioning a city that isn't walled, right? And so we see the same thing kind of play out with the temple if you read Ezekiel 47:9, verse 9.
Wherever the river goes, every living creature that swarms will live, and there will be very many fish once these waters reach there. It will become fresh, and everything will live where the river goes.
So we talked about this in episode 44, but this idea that God's Spirit, God's will, God's word will expound beyond Israel. It will expound beyond the temple, beyond the walls of Jerusalem. that we have this image being painted that restoring the physical temple and the walls will not be sufficient. Now, Jeremiah, and I think this is a great passage for us to kind of come in for a landing on the Old Testament with, because Jeremiah did notify the people that this new covenant would be necessary in order for God's will to really be fulfilled. And if you could read Jeremiah 31 to 34, Hannah.
The days are surely coming, says Yahweh, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant that I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, a covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, says Yahweh. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says Yahweh. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. No longer shall they teach one another or say to each other, Know Yahweh, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, says Yahweh, for I will forgive their iniquity and remember their sin no more.
Yeah, so we see this promise of a new covenant that was to come. And so even though we kind of see this contrast in Nehemiah of them recommitting to the old covenant won't be sufficient. And I think that's why we see this tension play out, that Nehemiah really tries to restore this kind of covenant, but Yahweh says, no, there needs to be a new covenant. So the story of the Old Testament actually ends with an end to God's discipline. The exile's over. They restored back in Judah. They're restored in Jerusalem. The temple and the wall were rebuilt. The Torah was restored. The festivals were reinstituted. And there are spiritual leaders in place that are passionate about the covenant that they understood with Yahweh. And yet we see something else is needed. We start seeing the importance of a Messiah who would come. And there's also this kind of final important spiritual lesson, I think, for us to talk about, which we've kind of been pointing out along the way. But spiritual leaders with passion and indignation can't change people for the long haul. I mean, ultimately, Nehemiah was frustrated that he couldn't bring about change in people's hearts. And yelling and cursing and hair pulling of zealous leaders don't bring about real change. Yahweh is the one who gives the law within. Yahweh writes it on our hearts. Yahweh makes himself known to us. Yahweh's grace will cover our shortcomings. And all of this points to the need for a Messiah.
That's a great setup there. You know, when you're talking about Nehemiah pulling out the hair and the yelling and cursing, I was reminded that Nehemiah means Yahweh comforts. That is his name.
Is that right?
So there's a complexity to Nehemiah.
There really is.
But you're right. I think he is paving the way for this hole that needs to be filled with real spiritual leadership and a Messiah. So thank you, Dave. And this marks the end of the series and the Old Testament.
It does.
So we will have two final and very important episodes that Dave mentioned on the intertestamental period. So we are calling those two episodes God's People Waited, because it will mark the 430 or so years of silence before the birth of Jesus. So those are important years to cover.
There's a lot to cover. 2 episodes, 430 years. But we have a plan. I'm excited about those episodes. So we'll see you then. Yeah.
See you then.
Hope you feel
everyone.
better by then.
I know. I've got a few, hopefully. More mint tea.
Okay.
See you all then.
See you later. Bye-bye. Thank you for joining this Thread conversation.
We're more than a podcast. Check out threadpodcast.org for more immersive content.
Though I'm way down here, I get a better view of this boundless world that I